Ever feel like everything's getting more expensive? Groceries, rent, even breathing. And let's not forget car insurance. It just keeps creeping up. But here's the thing. Insurify makes one part of life easier. It's an insurance comparison site that finds real-time quotes from dozens of top insurers. Insurance companies compete for your business, driving down prices. It's like having a friend who knows all the best deals, but without the smug grin. You could save as much as $1,025 a year, and you might even cut your bill in half. The best part, it's all online. No phone calls, no spam, no nonsense. You can be covered in as little as 10 minutes, and with an excellent star rating on Trustpilot, saving feels less impossible. So why not give it a shot? Visit Insurify.com and see how much you can save. That's INSURIFY.com. Average potential savings based on initial quotes received by 183,234 customers seeking insurance through Insurify. Actual savings may vary depending on state of residence, individual circumstances, coverage selections, and insurance provider. Savings results are not guaranteed.
Exclusively on ESPN Plus, UFC 313, Saturday. Reigning light heavyweight champion Alex Palou defends his title against number one contender Magomed Ankalaev, and an explosive lightweight bout between Justin Gaethje and Rafael Fiziev. UFC 313, Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern. Buy it on ESPNplus.com/PPV.
This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian makes the team collaboration software that powers enterprise businesses around the world, including over 80% of the Fortune 500. With Atlassian's AI-powered software like Jira, Confluence, and Loom, you'll have more time to do the work that matters. In fact, Atlassian customers experience a 25% reduction in project duration per year. Unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. Sorry it's slightly delayed this week, that's all my fault. Away skiing in the French mountains, not conducive to Wi-Fi, quietness, or a pool table in the lobby, which is obviously not great for sound. JR, I've got a feeling that you might be a bit of a pool hustler. Have you ever hustled anyone at pool? I feel like it's a vibe you've got in the locker.
Only on occasion.
Okay.
I feel like I'm very feast or famine at pool. I'd like to say that I was better at it than I am, but only on kind of a rare occasion that it actually all comes together.
Have you played pool with any IndyCar drivers in the paddock?
Yeah, I can't think of the last time I played pool with anybody was Buddy Rice.
Oh wow, that's so cool.
Not anybody on this field. And Buddy and I were actually, I think Buddy and I were like, it was a doubles pool situation in Indy. I mean, it must have been 2011 or 2012 or something. So a long time ago. Okay. We were teammates, so we weren't even playing against each other. So I'm not sure whether that counts or not.
Awesome. Anyway, what a great tangent and getting Buddy Rice in so early in the podcast. You've obviously tuned in to listen to our review of St. Pete, the season opener. A new era, it was branded for IndyCar, and one that I think delivered on that with multiple different ways. We'll obviously get into some of them soon. Obviously, Alex Palou. Every year we ask, who's going to beat Alex Palou? Is there going to be any chink in his armor? Is there going to be any weaknesses on display that will undo all of this hard work that he's been doing and all of this winning that he's been doing over the past few years? And the answer, even more emphatically than usual, was no, because he won the St. Pete opener for the first time. So fantastic result for him and the number 10 squad. Obviously a bit of a complicated race with strategy. The caution that came out on the first lap allowed anyone who started on the soft tyre to be able to pit and get rid of those tyres. Anyone who started on the harder tyre obviously had to delay, switch into the soft tyre and use that later in the race. A longer stint on those softer tyres, which meant basically a longer race time. And we saw that strategy come to the fore with those guys who had pitted on that first lap or under that first lap caution anyway, being able to come to the front. But it was Alex Palou undercut Scott Dixon in the last round of pit stops thanks to Scott not having a radio. Incredible scenes in the press conference after JR where Chip Ganassi was obviously very congratulatory of Alex Palou, but also said that Scott Dixon would have 100% 100% won the race if he had a radio working. Let's start there, JR. What's it like to not have your radio working in an IndyCar, and what do you think some of the challenges that Scott Dixon was facing there? Because that was a complicated race to try and run on your own with total radio silence. I imagine as a driver, that if you wanted any race to be sort of where your radio wasn't working, that wouldn't be one of the races that you'd want it to happen.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult. I mean, I definitely don't want to understate how difficult that is, actually.
Yeah.
And particularly nowadays where you're so, I mean, if I think back, to the beginning of my career, you still, like at Indy, you still had a signboard guy, like there were at least some provisions in place and some of those were sort of carryovers of just tradition, basically, but regardless, like there were some provisions in place in case you did have a problem that you'd kind of know what was going on, or you had some reference point for what was happening. You had some mechanism for the team giving you information. That's completely gone out the window now. Like that is no longer a thing whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard. I've only had this happen once, that I had a radio, or that radio comms to me weren't working. In that instance, I could still talk to the team, so the team could understand what I was saying, I think, but the radio wire got pinched in the car, so I couldn't hear them. It's very difficult. You suddenly, because you're so used to, in this day and age, you're so used to consuming a lot of information. You're used to consuming a lot of information from the pit stand, from, Scott even mentioned it post race, from your spotters. Like there's just a lot of people, if you're in that mode, if you're one of those drivers that has the bandwidth and wants to know what's going on and is kind of allowing that to dictate a little bit of how you're driving, which I think a lot of the guys up at the front of the grid are that way. There's always something that you can be doing. You're never really just in full on flat out mode or full on fuel save mode. You're not like in triage mode and are in one or the other that frequently. So usually you're kind of somewhere in between, that understanding the full scope of what's going on around you helps you sort of determine, like, okay, I want to be saving this much, but I also need to save the tires, and here's how I've got to last. And this is, if I'm trying to get around the car in front of me, there's like these 5 or 6 things that go into figuring out how that's going to work, or putting us as a group in the best position to do that, whether that's being able to go a lap longer, getting closer, getting out of some traffic jam that you're in, like whatever. And so that's just one part of it, is suddenly when that goes radio silent, you just lose all of that information. And that just all by itself is a pretty big adjustment to make. Like you will spend some time just trying to figure out, like, what the hell is actually going on here, which is not an insignificant distraction while you're driving. And the other part of it is, it was unclear. Was it clear in the press conference? Like, did he not have the radio from the very beginning of the race?
Pretty much, yeah. He didn't specify exactly which point it had gone, but it was pretty clear from how he was describing it that it was the whole race that he was out without it.
Right, and that's how I read into it as well. But I wasn't certain like how that all exactly worked out. But I mean, I would honestly say I think there's Scott Dixon is on a short list of drivers that could have even sort of pulled this off, I think. Like,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like to not lose your cool, to understand enough about what's going on in the race, to even just to kind of have the I don't know, foresight or whatever to sort of know that, like, all right, well, basically I just need to pit off the fuel light. But I think if we'd have gotten into a caution situation later in the race or something like that, I bet he probably would have made the right move in those situations. I mean, it's easy enough that you probably just follow the guy in front of you, but there was a big chunk of the race that he was leading the race at the end of the race, right? I mean, that's basically where this whole situation flipped, and why Chip said what he said was, I mean, it would have been much easier for Scott to not have a radio and like make the right strategic moves through the race if he wasn't leading the race, because that's when you're leading, you have no idea what you're just going to end up like he's going off his fuel light. But if the strategy is anything other than that, like if the right call to make is anything other than that, then he's going to get jumped by the cars behind him, because he's just going to have no idea when they're pitting and like whether that's the right call or not. And so, it's definitely, I guess I say all that really just to point out that for him to end up coming in second here, I mean, I think he would have realistically been third, had the two crew not had an issue with fueling, it sounded like. But even that, I mean, an incredible outcome. One that I'm sure he and the team are just pissed about that they didn't end up winning this race. This is one of the few races that Scott Dixon hasn't won. And he was, in a sense, without the radio issue, he was kind of in the catbird seat. Like, he looked very comfortable as the guy who was going to win for a chunk of this race. But yeah, it's definitely a very difficult situation to be in, for sure.
I think it's kind of the biggest compliment you could pay him was the fact that no one had really worked out they didn't have a radio until the end of the race, when he came in to do his interview at the end of the race, and kind of just blurted it out, and it was like, oh, okay, that explains quite a few things. But yeah, I think the whole there's a couple of things that I feel like maybe like they're not new to IndyCar, but just, I think just, as you said, kind of like a combination of factors that really fed into this. And I guess the other thing was that he didn't know how much push to pass people had around him. He wasn't getting any advice on how to use the hybrid system in different places or different things people were doing. All of this kind of information that you were kind of touching on there that, maybe we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago, or has become sort of more acute now. There's like you said, there's just so much more information that passes between the two. And I guess you would have kept the lap board, as you were describing, in the period you were discussing, because the radios were more likely to break, whereas it seems like they're relatively bulletproof now. But we had two in the same race, with Robert Schwartzman also having radio issues. And yeah, talk about two ends of the spectrum, with Robert Schwartzman being 2 years old when Scott Dixon made his IndyCar debut, and going into his first IndyCar race as a rookie and not having a radio in a race like this, where basically everything was all over the place. Probably if you'd learned to read strategy in an IndyCar race, you probably had a good idea of what was going on after the first caution and when those guys came into pit. But you can't expect Robert to be just to have that experience, basically, because he's not been there before. So that was really interesting. We got two ends of the spectrum there with Scott and Robert, both losing their radio. But Jay, I'll just stick in with Dixon for a minute. I kind of want to zoom out a little bit here and ask you this question, because I don't know if I've written a piece on this for the race, and it's a little bit kind of these things where you see something happen and it kind of triggers a different thought and you kind of take a bit of a tangent. But stick with me, I guess, because I feel like obviously what happened to Scott was total bad fortune, bad luck, whatever you want to call it. There's nothing anyone could have done to change that. He's just had to deal with the race in the way that he did. As you mentioned, probably one of the only people who could have got through that race and finished second with no radio. But it feels like this is, I kind of jumped off from there and thought, this kind of thing, it feels to me, happens more to Scott Dixon than it would to someone like Alex Palou. And we know, I want to stipulate here, first of all, how much I obviously rate Alex Palou, and his performance over the whole of Sunday was incredible. He sat on Scott Dixon's wing for the whole race. He was ready at that moment when he got the opportunity to deliver. His pit crew were on fire. The strategy was perfect. Obviously, his radio was working, but they were able to bring him in and make that pit stop. And that was obviously the race-winning move, that final pit stop where he was able to pit a lap before Scott Dixon and undercut him. And I guess you can't take anything away from the 10 crew. The strategy was perfect. The pit stops were perfect. Everything around him was perfect. And he delivered in that moment. So this is absolutely not to take anything away from Alex Palou. But I feel like Scott Dixon, we've been doing this podcast a while, JR, and it seems like we have races where these things kind of crop up much more for him. And there's kind of this added situation where we know that Scott Dixon's crew's moved around so much over the past few years. We know how many engineers he's had. And again, I'm just want to point out that I'm not saying that a different engineer means that he would have had a fixed radio. Just the fact that these kind of little niggly things that happen to people don't seem to happen to Alex Palou very often. And Scott, I feel like it does happen. And I wonder if it's a little bit of people expecting Scott to be kind of over the hill now at 45, going into the end of his career. And I wonder if Scott was 27 like Alex Palou, whether people would be more introspective of what's been going on with Scott over the past few years and some of the misfortune he's had. But I don't know if you would agree with this, JR, but it definitely feels like these kind of things, obviously not just radio issues, but just little things seem to happen in strategy or just little things going wrong in races where Scott seems to get the short straw, and it feels like this happens more often to him. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you'd have to say, I mean, I basically think, and it's so hard to be able to zoom out enough to really pick apart, like, do I have a totally unbiased perspective on this?
Yeah.
You know, like, or do I basically just hold like Scott Dixon and Joseph Newgarden at such a high standard that I'm just paying more attention to what's going on with the two of them, or so it's more noticeable when like things that seem out of the ordinary end up happening that cost them positions or points or whatever. Like maybe that's happening. Maybe that's just, I mean, to some degree that is happening just up and down the field to everybody. Right. But
yeah,
it seems like those two guys, to me, just over the last 5 years or something, since we've been doing this podcast, that there's just the most like points left on the table at the end of the year, basically, for stuff that just doesn't seem to be happening to other people. Yeah, they've both made some errors. There's a number of things that are just mistakes that occur, like that somebody that either they make as drivers or the teams are on the wrong strategy or things like that. So I'm not saying, like, let's say that basically probably all averages out more or less. And then you've got a couple of drivers, we'll say Palou in particular. I would throw Will Power into this group in his championship winning season that were particularly kind of resistant to errors, basically, in their championship years. Like that. So there's a bit of, I mean, I would look back at basically the last 3 or 4. I mean, so Alex has won 3 of the last 4, and Will was the one in between, right? So these last 4 seasons, those 4 championships have been won on consistency. And then in Palou's case, we'll kind of say the last 2 out of 3 of those have also been just an insane level of performance, also, in addition to an extraordinarily high level of consistency. Like Alex 2 years ago was about as maxed on both of those things in the IndyCar series as I think we've sort of seen in like the modern era of the sport.
Worst finish of eighth across the season,
and just an insanely high average finish, just without getting a bunch of gimmies along the way, like just absolutely firing on all cylinders and doing it with an extraordinary degree of consistency. We have really seen that from Alex Palou over the last 2 years, and here we are. He's starting this season with a W. But the flip side to that is I feel like we have seen an unusually high amount of just stuff going wrong, basically, for Scott over that same period of time. And then, even though this wasn't really a part of the question, I'll just throw Newgarden into that as well, because I think that that's been the case. Joseph's and Scott's issues, the reason they haven't been championship winners, whatever, altogether are different. It's not like you're seeing the same types of things affecting the two of those guys, but they just both stand out to me as the drivers that it feels like both of them should have been in championship contention basically every year for the last 4 years, and they sort of just weren't. I mean, one of the two of them was here or there, but not meaningfully so by the time you got to the last race at any point. And so, it's a tough one. I mean, I think Scott, for everything that's, he's a 6-time champ, he's an Indy 500 winner. I mean, the number of race wins that he's racked up and all this stuff. I mean, he will go down as one of the greatest of all time. But at the same time, he's still one of the guys that I think there's been the most left on the table. Like, he could just so easily at this point be a 4-time Indy 500 champ and an 8 or 9-time champion, as crazy as that sounds, without himself having been appreciably better in any of those seasons. You know what I mean? Like, just from some things happening in a different way, So I definitely agree with you on that front.
I think the other thing that we didn't mention and to throw into the mix is that those two guys are two of, I don't want to say this in a way that's offensive to the rest of the IndyCar paddock, but they are two of the biggest team players in the paddock. And I think both of those, I mean, Scott may be a little more likely to, but Newgarden especially, they just refuse to throw their teams under the bus under any circumstances. And I know for a fact that there were 3 or 4 races last year where Joseph had problems and things that went wrong, that were maybe team mistakes or, let's say team as a collective in that sense, things that had gone wrong behind the scenes or whatever. And he just won't talk about those. Like you could go up to him knowing what that problem was and ask him about it. And there's a good chance Joseph will find a way to kind of deflect or just not kind of directly answer the question, and certainly definitely not apply any blame to his team. And I think there's younger drivers in the series or maybe just even just people the same age as Joseph who would be much more likely to find a way to slip in there that it wasn't their fault and that it was, it was something outside of their control. Whereas I feel like Dixon and Newgarden are 2 of those guys in the series who, like I said, Dixon more so, I think he will every now and again, kind of flag something up as being an issue. But Newgarden especially, I think both of those guys are just so team orientated that, that those things don't come out. And I imagine, JR, it's quite hard as a driver to do that because, internally things are happening outside of your control, and they're almost like saying they're a stain on your record is a bit of a dramatic way to put it, but there's things, you could go back now and tell me, off the top of your head 5 or 6 results that are on your IndyCar record that are results that you didn't deserve or were nothing to do with you, but you kind of have to just sometimes swallow that, and for the good of the team kind of just accept that that's going to be something that you don't talk about and it's not something that you share outwardly. And I imagine that's a really difficult thing to do in those kind of periods.
There's no question. I mean, and you're definitely right. We've heard some of this bubble up from the 9, in the 9 camp over the last few years, but I mean, you got to know that's because it's gotten to a point, it's gone so far beyond the point that most other people would be saying something that, it's like Scott's needing to somehow leverage his voice to get something to happen internally. That was very much how I took all that, from a couple of years ago when that was more of a topic of conversation. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right with both of these guys. They know that they're both in situations that they're in for the long haul, which is part of this. And they know that I think they know that being in that situation, you got to have a ride or die group of people around you. And as the driver, you are probably the most important person to dictate that attitude within the team, basically. And so, you're sort of making a choice in these situations about, am I looking out for myself or am I looking out for the collective nature of how this group gets along, basically?
Or is there an advantage to speaking out that you think would help the situation in a way of kind of like, bringing that to the attention of your team, or just highlighting that as an issue where you feel like that would be an advantage to everybody, not just yourself?
Yeah, I think there are situations too where you might. I mean, and this is 100% speculation, but there are definitely times where within a group, within an entries team, so you've got like 10 core guys or something that are a part of your team's road crew, basically, that aren't people that are between cars or kind of half at the shop, half at the track, whatever. And well, when things aren't going well, like if something was screwed up in a practice session, or you had an error on the pad, or, somebody went the wrong way with a wing change or something like that, everybody knows that that's happening. Like, it's not like that's something that within a team you're sweeping under the rug or trying to avoid talking about. But that oftentimes when you get into these situations, like when I hear Scott Dixon being vocal, or when I have heard Scott Dixon being vocal about, issues within the team, like he probably has the support of a majority of the people within that team to be saying something, basically. Like, he's not throwing his entire crew under the bus in that situation. He's making a remark with purpose because he's trying to get Chip's attention. Like, hey, we all collectively recognize that something needs to change here on this. We're a guy short. That's why this is happening, And so I guess, just to your point, there's different ways to ultimately kind of address issues that might, or sort of personnel issues or things that are happening. One of those is to be public. I just don't ever put it past Scott Dixon to be playing chess rather than checkers in these situations, one way or the other. So if he says something, like, he's saying it because he's thought about it, and it's not just a reaction, you know?
Business taxes. We're stressing about all the time and all the money you spent on your taxes.
This is my bill?
Now Business Taxes is a TurboTax small business expert who does your taxes for you and offers year-round advice at no additional cost, so you can keep more money in your business. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on turbotax.com/business. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service.
Whether it's a movie night or just midday, Skinny Pop is a salty snack that keeps on giving. Made with just 3 simple ingredients for an irresistibly delicious taste and a large serving size that lasts. Deliciously popped, perfectly salted. Skinny Pop, popular for a reason. Shop Skinny Pop now.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
All right, JR, I know on the podcast sometimes, well, most of the time, we don't want to get too much into tyre talk because it can get very technical and put people off. But was there a way that Scott McLaughlin could win this race with the way that the strategy played out? Or do you believe that because of what happened with the caution on lap 1 and the fact that the guys were able to get rid of the soft tyre and switch onto the hard, did that make it impossible for Scotty to win, do you think?
I think basically he was just hosed at that point, one way or the other.
Yeah.
There's a chance that the way the pit cycles work at some point is basically just that that a caution falls at the right time, and it enables them to either get off the soft, like not have pits closed and get off the soft immediately without losing a bunch of track position.
Yes.
That was like possible to have happen, but was in the same situation that like a caution was going to have to come out immediately after that pit stop was made, not a lap before or not a lap later. Like, you know, there's a very small window where that could have happened and changed the outcome of the race, or sort of reset the two strategies. Other than that, though, like as soon as you were going to have to go more, you know, and maybe it wasn't like a tiny window, like, you know, it was kind of maybe a 10 lap window or something where that could have happened. And that as long as the pits stayed open so that guys got in without the field stacking up and then having to make a pit stop, like maybe that somehow sort of, you know, helps to reset it. But yeah, unfortunately, just a kind of a lost race for everybody that was on we'll call it kind of the alternate strategy with tires. And that's, you know, it's kind of one of those things that a lot of times in these events, it's you know, I think when the race plays out this way, and so it ends up being so clear that the cars that were on softs and then got off on that first pit stop, that they had just the obvious advantage for the entire rest of the event. It sort of makes you think, like, why would you have chosen a different strategy than that, basically? Well, the reason you would choose a different strategy than that is that usually the track is the worst, is the most abrasive for the soft tire at the beginning of the race. So in some respects, all the drivers that started on the softs that ended up in the catbird seat once that caution came out, like they were going to have an awful first stint. They were going to have an awful stint on the softs, basically. And the alternative strategy had the race, like, let's say the race had just gone green the whole time, which it wasn't going to, like, that's also just not going to happen. But you, in a way, you kind of initially have to think about what are my strategic options in that context. The way that then plays out for the guys that started on the hard tire is potentially you can race in such a way that you have a really short last stint, and you're doing that on the softs when the track is totally rubbered in, like the track is in the best condition for the soft tire at that point at the end of the race. And so maybe you don't have massive fall off if you take if you end up in that scenario, it just ended up turning out that because all of those drivers and teams were on the back foot, like they were at an immediate significant disadvantage. And then and just to point out, the only reason that was the case was because everybody on the soft tire pitted. So those cars came back out, like, Colton Herta was the first car on that strategy. It is very unusual that you could pit on lap 2 from like the lead of the race, or from, I guess he was running second, and come back out in like inside the top 10.
Yeah,
like that's like not how this tends to work. At that point, if you're on the alternate strategy, you immediately, like, you're the thirsty threes, you immediately know that you are screwed, basically. Like, this is just not, this is suddenly, you're watching the the win-loss predictor, and it's just like cranking downward at that point, like where you're likely to finish, regardless of how fast you are, regardless of how good your pit stops are, and almost at that point, regardless of what happens for the rest of the race. Like, at bare minimum, you're going to have one very slow stint compared to everybody else, even if you're at that point apples to apples on how many stops you have to make for the remainder of the race. And that's going to be the difference between first and where Colton was at that point, like wherever that ends up kind of playing out. So you ended up not seeing all of those drivers that started on the hards leave the soft stint to the end. I think that was broadly just because you got to like try something and hope that a caution falls your way. And the earlier that happens, the longer then you're starting to hedge your bets against like weird stuff happening in the race to try to get back in the game. Because if it just goes green from that point on, which is basically what happened, there's just no way that you're going to end up back in the game to win at that stage. And so McLaughlin ending up fourth was, the result of probably like a perfectly executed race on the part of him and the 3 crew, basically. But it just, they were so far on the back foot after what ended up happening just circumstantially at the beginning of the race that, that was that.
Yeah. I felt so sorry for Scott, because I felt like, well, it was his opinion and definitely mine that he would have won that race if it wasn't for that caution happening on the first lap there. He said, I wanted to pick out some bits of his quotes after the race, which were, we knew going in that was a risk of running the black tyre, which was basically what you said. We wanted a solid race, and I thought the risky strategy was going on the green for the reasons you've explained there, JR. And he also says, I think if there was no yellow on the first lap, we'd gone. And judging by his pace, when he was off sync almost from his first stop, wasn't he? But his pace was really impressive. He was able to build up a gap over the people, even the people on the same strategy as him. He was able to build up quite big gaps. And I guess at this point, if you're feeling sorry for Scott McLaughlin, you've also got to feel sorry for Colton Herta, who had that really slow stop with the right rear coming off, and then they were struggling to get fuel in the car, or if not struggling to get fuel in the car, there was a fuel issue, let's say. One thing that stood out to me there, JR, I'm sure a lot of people picked up on this, was that they had Colton's radio, not for the wheel issue, but they had it for the first stop where they brought him straight back in to top the car up with fuel, or to try and get more fuel in it. Rob Edwards was sort of communicating on the radio, and I was expecting to hear Colton shouting and screaming or being quite irate about the whole situation, but he was like flat tone reply, let me know if there's anything I could do to help, and then just got back on with it. And I thought that was really, it kind of felt like a backhanded compliment when people were saying that it was mature from Colton, because it kind of implies that he isn't mature, or that he's done some sort of growth there to become more mature. But I think knowing other drivers who are mature that would still have been quite, pissed off in that situation, that Colton was really relaxed. And especially knowing that this is the first race of the season, it's a great opportunity for him. He'd qualified second. He'd done a lot of the things that he's not been able to do in definitely last year at St Pete. I don't recall where he qualified in 2023, but he was a bit further back in 2024, wasn't he? And then he got caught a bit back in the pack, and he had that incident with Will Power last year. So he'd basically done everything right, apart from not quite being able to qualify on pole, but put himself up there in the right position, and everything just fell apart for him. Again, another driver who we didn't mention earlier in the lots of things happening outside of your control brigade. But yeah, I think I don't want to make it a competition of who do we feel most sorry for, JR, but I think, Scott McLaughlin and Colton Herta definitely had the rough end of the stick in terms of how things played out in that race.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, I think we don't often pat ourselves on the back for anything on this pod, but I'm going to do it here just for our pre-race. Our pre-race predictions were pretty damn good, actually. We basically both had McLaughlin and Herta among the guys that we thought were, the most serious contenders for both qualifying on pole and during the race. And I think had the strategies just been evened out, basically, I think we probably would have been talking about, and had Colton not had anything go wrong, we would have been talking about those two guys up at the front for the entire race, probably. Mm-hmm. You got to give Alex and Dixon a lot of credit for being there, and they clearly had exceptional pace through the event. So there's no question that they would have been in that mix of drivers. But, and even beyond that, I think we both shouted out Rinus VeeKay and Felix Rosenqvist, both of those guys qualifying in the top 12, Rosenqvist, being up again in the fast six along with Marcus Armstrong. So we'll give him a nod here as well. But yeah, it's just with kind of getting back to Colton, it's definitely, I would agree all around that him being, it wasn't so much just his tone that he wasn't, I think irate was the perfect word for it. You'd have to expect that from like anybody in that situation.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's the kind of point I was trying to make, was that that is what you would expect.
And I think the majority of guys, it's not like they're coming back over the radio like bitching at the team. I think you find that to be a fairly rare occurrence these days. But just kind of a like WTF in terms of what's going on and like what are we supposed to do, and just like a general level of frustration. You can often hear that coming through, which was not there at all at least in that radio transmission that we heard. I think the thing that was actually more interesting to me about it was that he was asking like, okay, now what do I do to help make this better? Like that you put yourself in his shoes in the car. He's kind of sitting there thinking, I can make up for this if you give me a chance. If it's possible for me to do anything here, like I can do it, which I think is kind of a cool little insight to his attitude. It's why I think that he's kind of the guy here if things just start coming together. Is we've seen what happens when it just all clicks for Colton Herta, and basically he's when he and Nathan are both on the same page, when they are not taking too many risks from a strategic perspective, just as a group, the 26 crew, and he's like locked in. He's proven to basically, they've proven to be unbeatable. They've proven to be just unquestionably a dominant force within the IndyCar series when all of those things line up. And you and I have talked about this on the pod at times, that it's like, even if they don't quite get to 100% of all of those things, they're still going to be the pole sitter and race winner in a lot of those instances. And so yeah, it's interesting it's interesting when you get just a little bit of insight into that mentality mid-race. I think it's helpful that it's the first race of the season, because you kind of know that you've got just time to make up for things that don't go right in this first race. But if you're a Colton Herta fan, you're feeling good about the fact that that's also how he's looking at it at this point, and not just like, we've got to go out here and crush everybody or else we're not going to make it happen. So yeah, definitely a missed opportunity for those guys to really show what they had, and that he was going to be in control on the right strategy, basically. So from that perspective, particularly so. But yeah, he I think is among the most interesting drivers and team combos to watch for the rest of the year for those reasons.
Life is made up of many gorgeous moments. Cherish them all, big and small, with Blue Nile. Whether it's for yourself or a loved one, Blue Nile's unrivaled selection of expertly crafted fine jewelry and statement pieces help make all your moments sparkle. Blue Nile's experts are on hand to guide you, and their Diamond Guarantee ensures you get the highest quality at the best price. Celebrate a life well lived in the most radiant way and save up to 30% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com.
So good, so good, so good.
New markdowns up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Fresh kicks, spring tops, new dresses. There's always a score.
I mean, the denim section is unreal.
Why do I rack? All the dresses.
I always find something amazing.
Head to your Nordstrom Rack store to find can't-miss deals on all the spring things. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Without PwC, the bottom line is that what you're doing today probably isn't going to get you where you need to go tomorrow. It's time to see ahead and get ahead. PwC can help you find ways to grow and new ways to make money. So reinvent your business model and meet the future with PwC. Learn more at pwc.com.
Well, speaking of his team combos, obviously at Andretti Global and his teammates were able to salvage a fairly decent day for Andretti with Kirkwood in 5th and Marcus Ericsson in 6th. Both started inside the top 10, qualified inside the top 10. Really important start to the season for Marcus Ericsson after, by his own admission, a disappointing season last year. So to be able to score a strong top 10 and almost top 5, I'm sure will be greatly received by him. It's mad. We could just run through every single driver over the next sort of 7 or 8 positions and have a really interesting story to tell. You mentioned Felix Rosenqvist in 7th. He was second on that strategy of drivers who'd started on the hards and had qualified 3rd, which, and Marcus Armstrong also up there in qualifying as well. The first race they were involved with Ganassi, obviously, and they were, we were a bit uncertain as to how that was going to impact things. We know Shank has had a relationship with Andretti for a long time and they've both been really good at St. Pete, but that's obviously carried over to Shank as well. They were obviously really strong, even with a new relationship with Ganassi as well. Christian Lundgaard 3rd on that strategy of the drivers who'd started on the hards. We were wondering sort of in our pre-season stories, how was he going to measure up to Pato O'Ward? How was, all we've seen is Pato O'Ward basically see off any teammate who comes into Arrow McLaren, and Pato O'Ward qualified 23rd, couldn't get the soft tyre working in qualifying, and he, by the way, was also one of the stories of the race, managing to get back up to 11th, having started 23rd, had a puncture early on. Lundgaard we mentioned in 8th, Rinus VeeKay you mentioned, JR we called out in the pod leading up to things, Alexander Rossi 10th in his first race for Ed Carpenter, we just mentioned Pato O'Ward. So yeah, so many awesome stories through the grid. I guess let me put this final question to you, JR. We'd also talked about Fox and this whole kind of start of a new era and everything that they've been doing in the lead up to the season. What were your kind of just your general feeling? And I'll, before I throw this over to you, just kind of say that obviously at this point, I don't think any realistic people are expecting a finished product here or some kind of perfect race broadcast at their very first go, and certainly not after so many years of NBC obviously presenting the coverage. But obviously there were bits that people won't like, and there were bits that probably didn't work as well as they'd hoped. But I really like the aeroscreen detail that we've kind of seen in Formula One in recent years, and there was some good drone footage and some good some good like still camera footage as well that really helped get the message of the speed across. So yeah, I'm just keen for your initial take on that, JR, and how you felt it all went.
Like I kind of just come into these things and with as a blank slate. Like I'm not expecting a lot from this, and it's not because I am in one way or another about really what I think is going to happen. It's just I don't really have, in some respects, I don't have enough of a vested interest in what it is. I certainly have no control over what it is. So I kind of just come at this like from a fan's perspective of like, I hope that it's really good, basically, for IndyCar's sake and like for everybody who's there, because like I want this to be a successful thing. Just like I think that's my general MO. But I guess I say that mainly to say that I probably wasn't going to feel strongly about anything in particular one way or the other, unless it really stood out. And that's basically just how I ended up feeling about it. Like for the most part, it's more or less the same thing that we've been watching for like a long time now. It's most of the same stuff. We're at a place that's familiar. It's probably I would say a majority of the same voices and people that you're listening to. I thought Will Buxton did a really good job for his first kind of foray into this role, and certainly in the IndyCar series. So he's not as familiar with everything as Lee was and had become and all that kind of stuff. So you've got some like little differences, but altogether I was sort of anticipating more or less we're just going to see from a broadcast perspective, particularly to your point, like it's the first race. So in their minds, their main job is just cover off the main stuff and like don't screw anything up. I have to assume that that's kind of how you would look at this. You've got to really make sure that you don't have stuff going wrong and that they've got time to layer in some other stuff. I agree that I think the sort of onboard detail was a little bit more just intuitive in terms of being able to pay attention to what's going on, what the driver's doing, very Formula One-esque. You know, we've seen that in F1 now for, I mean, I don't know how long at this point. So it's nice to just get that, layered in here as graphics. There's plenty of time, if you were watching the race and felt like there was some aspect of the graphics package that you didn't like, or that like didn't seem like it was working well or whatever, these are going to be things that they will continue to mess around with, so none of this is locked in until they get some feedback and see how it actually works over the course of a race weekend and are able to make some adjustments. So I guess the couple of things that stood out that I was left thinking like, it would be information that I wish I had watching the race here was push to pass. Like that was sort of something that you were relying more or less on the commentators to inform you as the viewer as to like where guys were at and what was going on a fairly regular basis throughout the race. Turned out that it wasn't playing a significant role in what was going on really. So from that perspective, it wasn't like a huge loss, but thinking about it in the terms of a new fan coming into watching an IndyCar race, I honestly, I kind of think that you would be left without really understanding how the push to pass situation works over the course of a race. And I felt like, I think that you would be left not knowing that the cars have a hybrid system, basically. Like it was completely devoid of any data or information about that, which I will say the way that I thought it was kind of overkill, the way that it was throughout a lot of the year last year. Like you're kind of getting the screen lighting up green or red based on regen or usage, and that was kind of like that. The way that it was being displayed was in some respects devoid of its own context of like, why should I care about this? Like what, this is too much information in a way that isn't being given to me as the viewer in a way that I can really understand what to make of it. This was sort of the other end of the spectrum, which was like, I mean, I was sitting there at times thinking like I had to like look up on my phone to make sure that they were actually using it for this weekend. There's some things like that I'm sure we'll just see some iteration of these things to be able to, get a little bit more insight into how things are working. But it comes back to a lot of the same stuff. I think, we'll talk about, we now, because we delayed for a day recording this podcast, we do know what the TV number was. So it was 1.4 million viewers. That's a pretty significant increase, 45% up from last year at St. Pete, a notable number, a notable increase just overall. So the way that I think this is being, that number is being packaged in kind of IndyCar's media is, that I think it's the highest rating for a non-Indy 500 race since 2011 or something is kind of, I think was a stat that I saw. That's absolutely meaningful. If that continues to be the trend for the rest of the year, like if we were 45% up on last year at every race, and that as an average, that's a huge deal. Like that is not an insignificant thing to have occurred over the course of a season. I will just point out, not because I want to be the guy throwing cold water on all this or to be a buzzkill about it, but St. Pete has traditionally been among the highest rated events. Like 2 years ago, St. Pete was at 1.2 million viewers and was the second highest rated event to Indianapolis. We weren't competing against anything else this weekend. And like we talked about in the pre-event pod, I guess I sort of looked at this like, I don't know what's going to happen, but if you're Fox, you had better see a big number to make good on all of the money that you're spending to activate this thing for the first race of the season. I mean, they had a Super Bowl commercial, like that's above and beyond what has occurred here to get people to watch the IndyCar series over the last, decade, basically. So I think all of that is to say, that's a very positive thing to see happen. I'm going to stop short of being totally hyped about it until we kind of see does this continue as a trend? Like, are we able to keep that viewership number high? And what are the things that are happening to do that? Or not, basically, over the course of the year. So it'll be interesting to see, what trend comes of viewership as the season goes on. But I think particularly with that in mind, that you're looking at this sort of everybody's hoping that part of the reason that number is going up is because we've got new fans. I would assume that that's a reasonable expectation to be making given the amount of cross promotion that's happening for the series in places that are not strictly targeting motorsports fans. Super Bowl commercial as an obvious example of that. What are the ways that we are not only just captivating those people, but making sure via the broadcast of the race that they are adequately informed about what's going on. So we're not leaving those folks confused about one thing or another, because I think that's an easy way to turn somebody off. So I like a lot of the things that were done. I liked that you could tell Hinch was having a hard time with it here and there, but I liked that the discussion about tires was generally using the term soft and hard instead of primary and alternate and green and red and, all of that kind of stuff. So as we've talked about on this podcast, over the last few years, there are definitely ways to make this a little easier to consume. It seems like that thought process has occurred within the, Fox organization, within IndyCar, within the the group of people that are a part of how this ultimately all gets communicated. And so on all of those fronts, basically, I'm just looking forward to seeing where we're at and where this conversation is 2 months from now, 4 months from now, 6 months from now, 8 months from now.
It's definitely going to be interesting because they can't have a Super Bowl every week. So they've got to work hard to keep these fans on board. And I think that was a good start. I think any more than what they did could have been biting off more than they could chew and causing themselves problems. And I expect the quality of the broadcast to really build up over the next few months. And as you said, JR, it'd be great to watch how that happens. That's all for this week's episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast. I'm off to go and fall over a lot more while learning to ski. JR, we'll be back soon. We'll definitely be back before Thermal because we'll have at least one driver interview in the gap between then. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure as always. I really enjoyed getting into some of the kind of the topics we did there in the way that we like to do, and that was a lot of fun. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.